Africa, we think of black people. But certainly over the last many, many centuries, Africa features another race, many of whom view Africa as their home. They don't see themselves as intruders. They view Africa as their home in the way we view America as our home. We don't view ourselves as intruders, right? How long have we been here? We started coming, the Europeans started coming somewhere in the 16th and 17th centuries. We certainly regard the Native Americans as natives, but by now we regard ourselves as natives. That is, this is our continent, this is what? This is our country. Well, the same thing happened in Africa. That is, there are two white races in Africa. Black Africa is essentially the Africa that exists south of the Sahara. But north of the Sahara is this thin coastal plain which faces the Mediterranean. And in fact, the first whites to come to Africa came into North Africa, and they're still there. We can divide the white race into two groups. The northern whites, those are those whites that come from Europe. And then there are what I call the southern whites. The southern whites are those whites who came from Western Asia. And it may be that the European whites started in Western Asia and then headed north and filled Europe. But the group that came from Western Asia, we call southern whites. For Europeans, they are ambivalent about their whiteness. But they see themselves as white. And certainly in Africa, they see themselves as white, and they see themselves as distinct from the blacks. On the edges of their borders with the blacks, it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between the two if you're an outsider. But if you're an insider, they what? They see the difference. Now, the two groups of southern whites that came from Western Asia and crossed North Africa and are still there, the overwhelming majority of the people in North Africa are these southern whites. The first group are called the Berbers. In fact, the Egyptians belong to that group. They most likely came out of Western Asia. They crossed over all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And these people settled down there, we don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago. And they regard themselves as the natives of the area. Now, they have had a checkered history in terms of their relationship with the blacks, because ultimately the Arabs and the Berbers were to come down, as I described last week, in this war between Christians and Muslims, were to come down and to bump into the black world, the world of black Africa. Today there is what I would call a line. It's the line between the whites of North Africa and the blacks. It runs somewhere through the Sahara, and it has many touchy points. For instance, Senegal is a black country. It's Muslim. Mauritania to the north is a black country, but the people in it do not see themselves as blacks. They see themselves as white. They are Arabs, they are Arab speaking. They're both Muslims, but they hate each other. And in fact, there's a long history of conflict because the people in Senegal have often been enslaved by the people in Mauritania, who regard themselves as white, and in Senegal they are black. And in fact, I went to the border there. The border is virtually closed. You can't cross the river because the hostility between the two countries is, despite the fact that they are both Muslim, is very intense. Mauritanians see themselves as white. Senegalese see themselves as black. If you're an outside tourist and you arrive, the Mauritanians look like the elevator operators at Hudson's. No, we would use the word mulatto, but we don't do that anymore in America. And the people in Senegal would be black, and there's a great deal of hostility. I was in Mali, in a place called Timbuktu. In Mali, the blacks, the Malinke, are Muslim. The whites are also Muslim. They're called the Tuaregs. The Tuaregs are related to the Berbers. They came down from Morocco and Algeria. They're down in this area, and they're sort of Cocoa, but they see themselves as white. And they dislike intensely the Malinke. The Malinke dislike intensely the Tuaregs, who lord it over them because it's the Tuaregs who built Timbuktu. They were in charge of business. They were in charge of trade and commerce. I have never encountered a more arrogant group of people. I had a Tuareg guide in Timbuktu, and he didn't like this, he didn't like them, he didn't like them, he didn't like them, whatever it was. And at the end, I gave him, I think, a pretty generous tip. He said, "I don't want a tip. We Tuaregs never take tips. You can do that with the Malinke, but we don't take tips." Do you understand? We're white. If you want to give tips to the blacks, you can do that. We don't take tips. Interesting. It's hard to imagine because if you're an outsider, you don't understand these hostilities exist. And how you perceive yourself isn't determined by some kind of biological test from the outside. It's how you historically see yourself. And the Tuaregs see themselves as white. And the Malinke see themselves as black. And you can go all the way across. You come into the Sudan. The Sudan is Arab and Muslim. Most of the people in Khartoum, in the Sudan, in the northern Sudan, most likely would be classified in this country as black, but they see themselves as white. They make a distinction between them and the black African tribes in the south who are Christian, whom they detest and whom they've been fighting, as I pointed out last week, for a long, long time. So even if there are blacks in the south who are Muslim, they're viewed as black. But the people in Khartoum see themselves as Arabs and see themselves as white. And one of the interesting things in North Africa is that it parallels Latin America. In Latin America, many people look Indian, but they think they are white. That's how they perceive themselves, because the issue of race is an issue of status in their mind. Now, the southern whites, the whites who live in North Africa, they're going to stay there. They're not leaving. And in fact, the hostility between them and the black Africans to the south will continue. And often it will continue within the Muslim world, because the conflict is between whites who are Muslim and blacks who are Muslim. And there is a racial conflict. It isn't just the war between Christians and Muslims, it's also a war between people who see themselves as whites and people who see themselves as blacks. I mean, one of the problems that Colonel Gaddafi has in Libya, he now wants to become, since he didn't do so well with other enterprises, he would now like to become the champion of Africa. Except Gaddafi is viewed as not black, he's viewed as white. And so it's hard for him to be the the hero mobilizer of black Africa. But our main focus today is not on what I call the southern whites who live in North Africa. I want to now turn to the northern whites. The northern whites are the Europeans. And the Europeans, going all the way back to the 15th century, having developed ocean navigation, showed up on the coasts of Africa. And for the last 600 years, they have been an important presence in Africa. First came the Portuguese, and then came the Dutch, and then came the French, and then came the English. And following the English, trailing along, came the Germans, all right? So they're people that we would normally recognize in the United States of America as white. They are white. They are Northern Europeans. And they arrive with all the technology of Europe, and they show up on the coasts of Africa. Initially, when they came, they did not make any settlements. They were mainly interested in the slave trade. So they were not interested in settling down. They were simply interested in setting up emporiums where they could buy slaves and then ship slaves. One of the reasons, obviously, was that they did not find the area attractive for settlement. One of the reasons was the climate. It was just too hot. Now, today people crave warmth and heat and whatever. It was a climate they were not accustomed to. Certainly today we can deal with all the bugs in the tropics because we have all kinds of medicines. But quite frankly, Europeans who settled down on the Guinea coast, I mean, they died of malaria, or they died of all kinds of infectious diseases for which they had absolutely no immunity. So they simply didn't settle. They did business, but they didn't settle. Now, one of the first groups to arrive on the coast of Africa ultimately settled down in large numbers in Africa. They're called the Portuguese. The Portuguese are the first. They arrived in the 15th century. Henry the Navigator, the Prince of Portugal, sent them down. They're the ones who rounded the coast of the Cape of Good Hope. They're the ones who reached India. And they're the ones who began the enormous slave trade between Africa and Brazil, producing today a population in Brazil that has an overwhelming black presence. And most of those blacks came from this area in Africa near the mouth of the Congo River. So the Portuguese established themselves near the mouth of the Congo River, and they brought thousands, hundreds of thousands of black slaves all the way across. In the 19th century, when other European powers showed up to seize pieces of Africa, the Portuguese said, well, we better seize some peace, because what? We'll be left with nothing if all we have is a slave station. And not only that, the slave trade had been suppressed largely through the determination of the British. So in the 19th century, the Portuguese decided to take the two slave areas that they had and to turn them into colonies. One they called Angola, pretty large place. Angola is larger than all European nations except Russia. And then on the east coast, they had seized slave stations from the Arabs. And out of these slave stations, one of them being Mozambique, they seized a whole piece of territory. And two great Portuguese colonies emerged, and at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, large numbers of Portuguese came from Portugal. Portugal was a very poor country. The economy was what? Dreadful. How much money can you make on olives? black olives, green olives, doesn't make any difference. I mean, how much money are you going to make from olives? There was no industry. So what they were looking for was better farmland. And what they found was something interesting. In the interior of Angola, there's a plateau, which means that you're higher up, and because you're higher up, it's cooler. And so it was a climate more pleasant for European whites. Generally in Africa, whites end up where there's a plateau. If you're down on the lower levels where the climate is very tropical and sometimes the rainforest, it was a deadly, an absolutely deadly climate for European whites. They did not wish to settle there. But if they could find a plateau and it was a little cooler and the land was arable, then they moved in. So thousands, hundreds of thousands of Portuguese came to Angola and to Mozambique. They settled down, they established farms, they grew all kinds of things, from wheat to tobacco, and sometimes, like in northern Mozambique, they grew sugar, and they made good money. One of the reasons, of course, was very clear. From the very beginning, they had a huge supply of black laborers. If you viewed their conditions of work, you might view it as slavery. But slavery was now illegal. It was somewhat like certain areas of the American South after the Civil War. So they had all this cheap labor. With all this cheap labor, you can make what? You make things work. Once labor becomes expensive, then what? You're finished. So they had all this cheap labor. So what was established indeed was a racist regime. Now, one of the things about the Portuguese that happened in Brazil as well was they were racist, but they were not consistently racist. They did what I would call hanky-panky, and they produced, that's not an anthropological word, by the way, in case you were worried. It's not listed in an anthropological dictionary. And they produced a large number of mulattoes, which served their purpose. You see, in America, we force mulattoes to identify with the blacks, which we say you're black. You can look like Coleman Young, Andrew Young, whatever it is, you are what? One little smidgen, you are what? Black. But in other countries, whites did the opposite. If you were a mulatto, you had privileges above what ordinary blacks had. If you were full black, you were what? Way down at the bottom. But if you were a mulatto, then you had privileges. We did that in some small way in Detroit before World War II. If you were sort of cocoa-colored and light, you could get jobs that what? Very dark blacks could not get. Those are the elevator operators in Hudson's. So the Portuguese actually developed this mulatto society. And so some of these people didn't side with the blacks. They didn't want to be black. They wanted to be regarded as above the blacks. So indeed they could be used by the whites. And in fact, interracial marriage occurred. The same thing happened in Brazil. And actually was a stabilizing force, because while in North America all the mulattoes were thrown into the blacks, in Angola and Mozambique they achieved a kind of higher status than blacks. They were between blacks and whites. They were the people of mixed race. It happened the same way with the British in India, the Anglo-Indians. So a whole white society developed here, and out of it came cities. The Portuguese developed, first of all, administrative centers, and then the administrative centers turned into substantial cities. Some of the white farmers ended up in the administration, or they had townhouses, or whatever else it be. In fact, a fairly large city appeared on the coast, which became the capital of Angola. It's still there. It's now a ruin. but it was a very thriving city. It was called Luanda. And there was a city called New Lisbon, which was right in the middle of a fairly substantial size. In Mozambique, the same thing occurred. Mozambique didn't have the plateau, so it didn't attract quite as many of the Portuguese. But the Portuguese who went settled down, and in fact there's a town which is the capital of Mozambique. Today it's called Maputo, but when I first went there it was called Lourenço Marques, and you could get there by train actually from Johannesburg. And many, many South African whites went there to the beaches. And in fact, the people who ran Mozambique were the Portuguese and the mulattoes who supported them. It was a successful white administration, and before 1975, and that's when I first took my trip, before 1975, Mozambique and Angola were regarded as part of Portugal. In the main square in Lourenço Marques, it said, "This is Portugal. This is white territory. This belongs to whites. Yes, there are blacks here, whatever else. This is part of a white country called Portugal, a province of Portugal." And in fact, they were viewed as citizens of Portugal. And then in 1975, there occurred this rebellion in Portugal. The conservative government in Portugal, which had fascist roots and which was never overthrown during World War II or after World War II, was overthrown in Portugal because it was simply a corrupt regime. And the new socialists who took over the Portuguese government decided to end the empire. The reason they decided to end the empire was that in the 1960s, influenced by what was going on north of Angola and Mozambique, there were all kinds of rebellions. White farmers were being killed. It was a kind of minor Mau Mau. And in fact, the socialist government said, the time is past when we can maintain a colonial empire, and just like that, they ended it and turned the government over to the blacks, who couldn't agree on who should be in charge. So now the people in Angola and Mozambique, the whites, are trapped in a civil war between blacks. So in a matter of 5 years, almost the entire white population of Angola and Mozambique, all the Portuguese, decided to move. They either went back to Portugal, and I've been to Portugal several times, and every time you go to Portugal, you bump into what we call the colonials. They're very unhappy. They came to Portugal. They have no servants. They have no cheap labor. They have no farmland, and they're looking for a job, and they speak Portuguese with a funny accent. Oh. So they're down and out on their luck, and they're always mumbling and grumbling. I remember going into a restaurant once in Lisbon, and the restaurant was owned by one of these colonials, and I was trying to eat my codfish, and the whole meal, she's talking to me about how unhappy how wonderful life was when she was a farmer and owned an estate in Angola, but I couldn't do anything for her. I mean, I was on a trip. I mean, I didn't know how to relieve her anxiety. I paid her money for the codfish, but I didn't know. But no, I was just tuning in to what's happened to these whites. They came home, and they're unhappy because their life in Angola and Mozambique had been fantastic. And in fact, some of the people who came back to Portugal and who weren't well received are the mulattoes, because there was a great deal of resentment against the mulattoes because of their cooperation with the whites, with the Portuguese. So they show up in Lisbon, but in Lisbon they're blacks. No, no. But that's all gone. Finished. The second place that many of them went, which seemed a better choice because they could at least get some of their privileges renewed. Many of them fled south to South Africa because there was a large white community in South Africa. And in fact, if you go to South Africa today, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Portuguese. And these Portuguese have come from Angola and Mozambique. In fact, before 1975, one of the strategies of white South Africa was to support Angola and Mozambique, to make sure that they stayed in the empire of Portugal. They wanted the whites to stay, but the whites are gone now. And in fact, since they went, Angola and Mozambique have gone through terrible times. Angola is still trying to resolve a civil war among its blacks, which has totally devastated the country. It's a ruin. It's in far worse economic shape than it was in 1975. Mozambique, which went through a terrible, terrible civil war too, was finally pieced together and is beginning to recover. But quite frankly, the economies of both places are still trying to get back to where they were in 1975, which now makes a point. The coming of Europeans to Africa certainly involved slavery and exploitation. But where they settled down in numbers, they helped to develop the economy because they were familiar with a European economy. So they raised the standard of living of certain people in Angola and Mozambique, whatever it be. They were able to do that. And so the question arises, it's a question not only for whites but for blacks. Is the presence of whites good? If somehow or other you could resolve the issue of racism, is the presence of whites, given their culture and their background in what we call industrialized Europe, is it good for Africa, or is the best thing to do just to shoo them out? Now, for Angola and Mozambique, the loss of its white populations was an economic disaster. Now, another group of whites who showed up with a similar story we've seen in the movies. We all know that Meryl Streep played, remember that? Oh, that wonderful woman, Karen Blixen, do you remember that story? Oh, yes, in the movies with Robert Redford. So it was an irresistible story. We all saw the story. So what are we talking about? Well, we're now talking about the English in the 19th century. The English in the 19th century had been engaged in the suppression of the slave trade. And I've alluded to this in previous lectures, when people say that governments only behave in terms of their own selfish vested interests. The British committed their navy to the destruction of the slave trade. And in fact, there was no great economic interest attached to it. Now, people have striven, those who are always what I would call cynics. They're always looking for the vested interest that the British had in suppressing the slave trade. The answer is they had much more trouble than if they hadn't bothered. There was no vested interest in suppressing the slave trade. It was done from the point of view of British public opinion for moral reasons. They committed their navy to do this. And in fact, one of the sources of anger between them and the Dutch Afrikaners in South Africa was over the destruction and suppression of the slave trade. So I'm going to leave it to you to figure out the economic vested interest of the British in doing this. But along the way, they had to close down the slave ports. So they succeeded in doing that along this coast. And in the end, they ended up taking territory, which for many, many years was more costly to maintain than if they had chosen to leave it. But one of the major slave emporiums of Africa was Zanzibar. It was an island controlled by Arabs, and the Arabs used it as a base for the slave trade. And so it was very important for the British to take Zanzibar, which they did, and most of the slave posts along the coast. When in the 1880s, the European powers, for reasons of prestige, made this scramble to seize whole areas of Africa, so the British or the English did what the Portuguese did. They simply moved from the coast into the interior. Now, they were foiled in one attempt. At the end of the 19th century, there was a rising power in Europe that felt it had been left out because it had never been successfully united. They were finally united in 1871. The name of the country was Germany. And Germany felt left out, and now we have no German empire. Well, the only place to get an empire that was left was Africa. So the Germans show up, and the next thing you know, right across from Zanzibar, a German army lands, and they take this whole area that today we call Tanzania, or Tanganyika. So the British now scramble, and they take this whole area near the coast. One of the slave places is a place called Mombasa, which I mentioned last week, and now they move into the interior. What they're heading for is a very, very fertile area around a big lake, which was discovered by English and British explorers, called Lake Victoria, and that area is called Uganda. So you want to get from the coast to Uganda, and in between, they acquire this area which today we call Kenya or Kenya, whatever you want to call it. Kenya, and they called it British East Africa. Now, in order to transport the agricultural goods from Uganda to the coast, they needed a railroad. Now, building a railroad was not easy because right in the middle of Kenya is a plateau. So you now have to what? You have to build the railroad up, 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 up. Right when you reach the edge of the plateau, they built a kind of railroad station. The name of it was Nairobi. And once the British arrived with the railroad up on the plateau, they looked around. Looks just like England. No, not like it. You could breathe. It was cool. Do you understand? Even the animals wore sweaters. I don't know. No, I mean, it was comfortable. It was the kind. Mombasa. You couldn't settle down in. You couldn't settle down there because it was what? It was hot, hot, hot. I mean, today people spend enormous amounts of money to go to places that are hot, 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 but they're air-conditioned what? Hotels and the whole thing, and they're physicians and whatever. I mean, it was like a malarial whatever. But once they reached up there, they looked around. Oh, this is gorgeous. So the English said, well, I'll take 3,000 of those acres. No, I'll take 2,000. Do you understand? They were in this vast territory where they could help themselves to whatever they wanted. And the next thing you know, they're advertising for English settlers. So dozens, hundreds of English settlers arrive, including a few, attached Danes, okay, like Karen Blixen. And they arrive and they find, oh, this is a wonderful place to grow coffee. Oh, it's a good coffee market. And even some tobacco and whatever, and they could have as much land as they want. But, I mean, they seized the whole of it, the whole plateau. If you've ever been to Kenya, Most people don't go to Mombasa, except Israeli tourists. But I mean, most people end up in Nairobi to see the animals, to go on a what? To chase the animals on a safari. And when you get there and you look around, the area is what? It's gorgeous and it's comfortable. And sometimes at night it's very, very cool. So the English pour in. And they love it. And in fact, the people who come are sometimes not simply poor people, like the people who showed up in the American colonies, or ex-convicts, or present convicts. Some of them have titles. They want estates, the Earl of this and the Baron of this and whatever, and they settle down in Kenya, and Kenya becomes one of the favorite spots for English settlers. At the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, they're heading there in the same way that Karen Blixen headed there. And what was available on the plateau? Well, there was a whole nation there called the Kikuyu. They'd lived there for centuries. They were black. And they owned the land, presumably, except they didn't seem to have a... Oh, my. Not me. Oh. Presumably... Yeah. Now they didn't have those among the Kikuyu. That was one of the, and they didn't have land titles. Okay, they I know no. All right, there we are. No cell phones, no land titles, and there are the Kikuyu, and what they have is cheap labor. So it's different from England, where the labor is what? Getting more and more and more expensive. There it is. You can run your farms dirt cheap, paying slave wages, do you understand, to the people. And so a whole culture arrives. There was a time when Nairobi wasn't a crime-ridden city. It was gorgeous. It had beautiful clubs. The first thing British build before anything else, even before they build the bathroom, is a club. Which you can't, can you live without a club? Can you live without a club? Can't live without a club. So they built the clubs, and I mean, life for the English was absolutely wonderful. Dozens of people, hundreds of people in England heard about Kenya. They came out to live in Kenya, and when they arrived, it was like paradise. You opened your window and a giraffe stuck his head in, a little pleasant vegetarian giraffe. I mean, it was cute, it was lovely, it was wonderful. You could see lions over there, but ultimately they cleared the place, and all these people showed up. And there they were, and then the Second World War, and after the Second World War came the Cold War, and in the Cold War, the problem arose. The Russians wanted to take hold of Africa. The way you take hold of Africa is that you encourage black people to what? Rebel against whites. And by the late 1950s, early 1960s, there had started a rebellion mainly in Kikuyu land, led by a very imposing Kikuyu by the name of Kenyatta. Remember Kenyatta? Oh, and the rebellion had a name. The rebels had a name. The guerrillas had a name. They were called the what? The Mau Mau. And pretty soon they're raiding farms and they're killing the landowners. And now they're sitting at the clubs and they're what? They're terrified and they're frightened. And what's the future? Well, in the 19th century, the future was you called up Queen Victoria. And she said, "This is my empire. Nobody's going to tangle with my empire." Okay, fine. So nobody's going to tangle with the empire. So you send what? Boom, boom. You send British soldiers and they what? They take care of the Kikuyu. I went to, in 1960, England, having been exhausted by the Second World War and having been replaced by the United States of America, gets its message from America. And the Americans say, look, we're fighting the Russians and what? We're going to have to liberate these countries because we can't do this, otherwise we'll simply turn Africa over to the communists. So pull out. Fine. So one day they're sitting at the club and somebody says, "Did you know Kenya is being turned over to the blacks?" Do you stay, don't you stay? Well, the overwhelming majority of whites left it. I want to tell you, it was very hard to leave. Life for whites in Kenya was absolutely wonderful. You had a cook, you had 3 maids, you had a chauffeur. I mean, to give it up was so difficult. But in the end, most of the whites could see the handwriting on the wall. Now a black government takes over in Kenya, and the black government now says, that land belongs to the Kikuyu. We have to return the land to the Kikuyu. So the overwhelming majority of the whites in the 1960s and early 1970s simply pulled out. And from time to time in London, you'll bump into what I would call a former colonial from Kenya. Is he happy? Drizzling rain. I mean, he lived in, do you understand, in Nairobi with the giraffes and the lions and these gorgeous coffee plantations and made money. And now he's reduced to what? They don't even know who he is. Now, there has remained, because it is so charming, a whole group of people. There are still in Kenya something like 40,000 whites. They've hung on. Do you understand? Most of them no longer own large tracts of land because the land is what? Been taken from them. Many of them have gone into what I would call the animal business. We now have hundreds of thousands of people all over the world that are not satisfied with the local zoo. And what they want to do is to go over to East Africa, where there are still large numbers of what we call higher mammals, and to look at them, photograph them, stand on trucks looking at them, whatever it be. And in fact, many of these people have gone into what I would call the animal viewing, the animal viewing business. I stayed in a place, the last time I was in Kenya, it was quite wonderful. The owners were very British. And they had formerly owned tracts of land, and their grandparents had come over in the original group. But now they were running a giraffe farm. It was wonderful. Their estate has been turned into a place where tourists come. And in fact, you wake up in the morning, and in fact, giraffes stick their heads through the upstairs window. So it's a way of surviving. Is it like the old Kenya under with Karen Blixen? The answer is no, but mainly the whites have gone. Kenya is basically a black country with a fairly insignificant white minority. The whites who used to run Kenya are gone. So from Angola, Mozambique, gone. From Kenya, gone. So now I'm going to turn to the third place, the place where a fairly substantial white population still remains, and it's the population that we're most concerned with right now. Actually, the people who started the settlement were the Dutch. The Dutch had defeated the Portuguese and taken over large parts of their empire. And the main part of the empire they took from the Portuguese was Indonesia. Now, to get from Holland to Indonesia, you've got ships along the way, and the ships need to be fueled. So they built a fuel stop right where the ships have to turn from the Atlantic Ocean into the Indian Ocean, and so was founded Kapstad, or Cape Town. It was a fuel station. But in order to fuel the ships when they came, to give them victuals to eat, you needed some farmers. So some Dutch farmers showed up, and they began to farm. And then, at the end of the 17th century, because the Dutch established this place in the 1650s, at the end of the 17th century, there were some refugees from France who were Protestants like the Dutch. They're called Huguenots. And most of the Huguenots went to England, to Prussia, to America, but a few Huguenots made their way down here, and they became farmers too. And so a little Dutch colony shows up. You can call it the Cape Colony. Now, from the beginning, there was only a small number of whites. In order to do all this work, you needed what? Cheap labor. And the cheap labor was available. They came in three varieties. Bushmen. The Bushmen were no good. They're not strong enough for heavy work. So they just died out. Then came the Hottentots. The Hottentots were a mixture of Bushmen and blacks. They were stronger. And in fact, they became slaves to the Dutch and the Huguenots down there in the colony. And in fact, the farm areas began to spread. There was this gorgeous land. And in fact, Cape Town was at a latitude that's something like Atlanta. And they were what? Very comfortable. Very, very comfortable. They just loved it. And so they stayed. And I must say that not many more people came from Holland or from France. Out of a small group of several thousand people, ultimately, 2.5 million people were to emerge through simply something which is not done as much in Bloomfield Hills as it used to be. Something called reproduction. No, I mean, if you have 11 or 12 children, just figure it out. You have 12 children, and let's say 9 survive. Each of those 9 has what? 12 children. Do you understand what happens over just a short period of time? So you have all these whites, and they're down there, and they have cheap labor. They've got Bushmen, they've got Hottentots, and then coming down from the north is a whole group of blacks called Bantus. And in fact, they're enslaved. There are all these wars, and ultimately the colony expands. And from the beginning, there is racism, but there's also hanky-panky. Now, in South Africa, there still exists a large population of people who are mulattoes. The word used for them in South Africa is colored. We use the word colored, we did before World War II, to mean black. But they use the word colored to refer to the what? Part white, part black, and they're called colored. The colored were treated badly, but they weren't treated as badly as the blacks. And in fact, it's the same kind of distinction that arose in the Portuguese colonies later on. So there is this white population, and it has what we would call the technology of Western Europe, and it imposes its control over the area. And the white population keeps growing, and as they keep growing, the farmers simply move this way along the coast, and then they begin to move a little bit north. The area is one of the most beautiful areas in the world. After a while, they discovered, the Huguenots did this. They came from France. They discovered how to grow grapes. And from grapes, they made wine. Some of the finest wines in the entire world come from this area in South Africa. And when you travel through it, you can still see the houses of the Dutch farmers. The word for farmer in Dutch is boer, which is related, of course, to the English word boer. They spell it B-O-E-R, we spell it B-O-O-R. People in the city think that farmers are what? Boers. No, I mean, they're ill-mannered, they're rough, so they're called boers. That's the original meaning of the word. And so these Dutch and Huguenot farmers are called what? The Boers, and the language they speak is a kind of modified Dutch. And they settle down there. But their fortunes are not good, because at the beginning of the 19th century, the British, fighting Napoleon, want to make sure that the route to India is protected. And on the way to India is Cape Colony and Cape Town. They show up in 1803. They take the place. Now the Dutch, are they happy? They're not happy, but initially they accept English rule because the English are white. And in fact, everything is okay because most of the whites are Dutch. But in 1820, the English decide that there's a huge number of people in Great Britain who are poor. And the way to solve the problem of poverty is not welfare, it's to what? Ship them out. So they shipped them out to Canada. A lot of them came to America. And a lot of them went to Australia. One of the destinations for these English settlers was South Africa. In 1820 they pour in. The Dutch now are not so happy. There is now a conflict of culture. One group is English-speaking and the other group is Dutch-speaking. And then comes the rub. English culture has achieved the state where moral opinion says that slavery is wrong. So in 1833, the English government in the Cape Colony abolishes slavery, and the next thing you know, there's like a civil war. The Dutch will not give up their slaves. That's to give up their economy. So they make a resolution. The resolution is that they will leave the Cape Colony. There's a lot more land in Africa to the north. They'll simply march north. Now the Dutch word, the Afrikaner word, and I want to tell you, these Dutch people call themselves not only Boers, they call themselves Afrikaners. They had lived in Africa so long they saw themselves as Africans. Afrikaner means what? An African. They were white and they were African. This was their home in the same way as it was the home of the blacks, and now they march north, and the word for marching is trek. We have that word in English now. It's a Dutch word. And so they trekked north into a plateau, semi-desert, not as good as the coast, but almost half of all the Dutch in the colonies simply picked themselves up and they moved. They didn't want to be in the hands of the British, and then they bumped into huge nations, Sotho, Zulus, who whatever. They fought them, defeated them, and settled down on the land, kept their slaves, and now expanded. Reproducing like mad, reproducing like mad. Well, they had escaped English control, but not for long. In the 1870s, some explorers found diamonds. Oh. And then in the 1880s, some explorers found gold. And then once the diamonds and the gold were found, the English, who had been perfectly happy to send these people, north, who cared? Let them stay there. They were only troublemakers in the colony. Now the English want the area. And in fact, the leader of the English is a prime minister of the colony. His name is Cecil Rhodes. And the next thing you know is there's a war between the English and the Dutch. Now, what is interesting about this war is the overwhelming majority of the people are black. There are two groups of whites who, if they had any sense, would unite, right? No. They're fighting each other. And while they're fighting each other, the blacks don't rebel. Had the blacks rebelled, that would have been the one. They don't rebel. The English and Dutch fight each other. What is interesting about the whites in South Africa, different from Angola, Mozambique, Kenya, whatever, was that most of their time, the whites aren't fighting the blacks, they're fighting each other. Isn't that an interesting? They're fighting each other. The English hate the Afrikaners what? The Boers hate the English. In fact, the war between 1899 and 1902, which finally settles the whole thing, ended up with the English creating concentration camps where they put white Boers. The Boers never forgot that. But out of the war, the British created a whole new thing. In 1910, they proclaimed it. It was called South Africa. And South Africa had a white population, which was about 10% of the population. 10 to 12% of the population was white. The rest of the population was black. Now, although the English and the Dutch didn't like each other, initially the English held power. But the English and Dutch were smart enough to realize that their main enemy, from time to time they realized it, were the blacks, because what they wanted was cheap labor. And if the blacks should ever rise up in rebellion, what? It's the end of cheap labor. So starting back in 1910, they devised a system which later on in 1948 received a name, but which existed before. It's called apartheid. Right? Already by 1913, the English and the Dutch had agreed that most of the land in South Africa could only belong to whites, could not be owned by blacks. And in 1913, they passed a law depriving blacks of ownership of land in most of South Africa. They also decided that you needed a certain level of education in order to vote. It was like the South. And in fact, since education was denied the blacks, they didn't qualify to vote except a few in the Cape Colony. And they also decided that blacks were basically ineligible to run for public office. So the rules and regulations, which we normally identify with apartheid after 1948, existed in real form going all the way back to 1910, to the establishment of South Africa. South Africa was part of the British Empire. The English in South Africa, who were the dominant white people, they had most of the important offices. They ran the army, they ran the police, they ran the industry, they ran the banks. They were loyal to England. They liked being part of the British Empire. But after 1910, South Africa began to run its own affairs. However, the blacks were kept down. And of course, the diamond and gold industries were terrific. And then something happened that was to trigger a reversal. For the blacks, it made no difference. See, for the blacks, whether the English were in charge or the Dutch were in charge, made only small differences. The English tended to be less racist than the Dutch, that's all. But they were both racist. South Africa was a segregated world in which most of the wealth and the land were concentrated in the hands of the whites. But the battle between the English and the Dutch did not stop. Dutch always felt that this was their place. And the English felt, well, now they were in charge, this was the British Empire. During World War II, the Dutch refused, in many cases, to endorse the war, to support England in the war. And after World War II, in 1948, an election was held. And in fact, since the Dutch were the majority of the whites, there were 4.5 million whites, 2 million English, 2.5 million Dutch. The only people who could vote were white. The Dutch won the election. and they now are in charge of South Africa. The roles are reversed among the whites, and now they change everything. The heads of the army, Dutch, Afrikaner. The heads of the police, Afrikaner. All the civil service jobs that the Dutch couldn't get under the English, now what? Given to the Dutch, the English are out. They take over. And now the Dutch turn a system that had never been fully defined into a fully defined system. See, the English practiced apartheid, but it was very English. The English don't like to what? Define it. They like to leave it sort of what? Vague. It's there, but it's not defined. But the Dutch were much more literal. And in fact, they created the system of apartheid, which was more ruthless than ever before. It featured the total separation of blacks and whites, except you couldn't separate them because the whites needed the what? The blacks to do the work. So how could you separate? How can you separate the maid, the cook, the mine worker? I mean, they have to work among you. However, they used a reason, by the way, for suppressing all opposition. Every opposition to the apartheid regime was labeled, after World War II, communism. So anybody who protested the system was called a communist. And if you were communist, you could be arrested. However, after World War II, there was this idea of democracy. So the Dutch invented a very clever ruse. That is, if everybody is entitled to vote, then the blacks are entitled to vote in South Africa, and they should be entitled to elect the government. The Dutch said, we're democratic. What they did was, they created 9 areas in South Africa on land that were like toxic landfills. And they said, these are the territory of the blacks, which they're entitled to run. And every black in South Africa is not a citizen of South Africa. He is a citizen of one of those 9 areas. So we're not depriving them of the right to vote. What? You know, it would be as though we said, River Rouge is black land. Blacks are entitled to vote in River Rouge, but they're not entitled to vote here because this is what? This is white land. Are we depriving them of their democratic rights? No. They have a right to what? To vote. But most of the blacks can't fit into River Rouge. Don't worry. They can live in white land, but they'll be aliens. So we're not depriving them of their democratic rights. Don't they have a homeland? Huh? They have a homeland? The whole idea was the idea of the Bantustans, and all of it was reinforced by the army and the police. I mean, the support for the system came from the army, it came from the police, it came from the vested interest of all the whites who said how terrible the regime was. Because I visited South Africa in the 1970s, and English people would say, oh, it's so terrible, 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 terrible. But they wouldn't do anything about it, because to do anything about it would mean they'd have to lose their cook, their maid. No. They mumbled and grumbled, and they kept saying, oh, we're not terrible like those people over there. But it was a what? It was a very, very seductive regime and seductive system. It was supported by religion. The clergy of the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa supported the whole system. But then it collapsed. It collapsed for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons it was sustained was that America helped to sustain it. America's primary concern until 1991 was fighting the communists. Could you find a country with a government that hated communists more than South Africa? No. So America protected South Africa. It viewed South Africa as a bulwark against communism. So that meant that South Africa could always rely on America so long as the commies were around. Actually, South Africa had a vested interest in keeping the communists in power. Do you understand? Because once the communists lost power, there'd be no reason for America to support South Africa. So already in 1985, Gorbachev comes to power. It's clear the Soviet Union is falling apart. Once the Soviet Union falls apart, communism is gone, and black power is rising in the United States of America. The American government changes its mind. Once South Africa stands totally alone, it can't go on, because now every protest that occurs in South Africa will not be ignored by America. It will be what? Noted. So starting in 1985, the apartheid regime simply begins to fall apart. And it's also enhanced by something else. There are 43 million people in South Africa. There are 4.5 million whites. And you're trying to run an industrial economy which was created by the whites. You need managerial personnel. The white population cannot produce a sufficient number of managers. And the black labor is malcontent. So starting in the 1970s, many of the leaders of major corporations, white corporations in South Africa, said to the Dutch government, said to the Afrikaner government, we have to end apartheid because this economy cannot work unless we can have the free movement of labor. So if you put business pressure together with the fall of communism, the whole system comes tumbling down. The sign of it is that in 1990, in February of that year, the leader of the black resistance against the whites in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, is released from prison. And 4 years later, an election is held in which everybody's entitled to vote. And the whole white regime is overthrown. The party of black resistance, known as the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, overwhelmingly wins the election. And in 1994, there is the question, still a question, big question. If I'm white, do I stay? Remember what happened in Angola and Mozambique? What? Didn't take very long, they were what? They were out. Remember what happened in Kenya? Didn't take very long, they were out. Do I stay? Now, that was a very important moment. Now, the man who arranged for the whites to stay is an extraordinary man, who I think is about 85 now. He's in his 80s. He's one of the great political leaders of Africa. His name is Nelson Mandela. He spent 27 years in prison. And having come out of prison, having been a prisoner of the whites for 27 years, you could imagine that he might be bitter, right? And then you got to take out, take away the factories, take away the land, drive them out. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that because he knew that even though most of these whites were still racist, and most of these whites were not sorry. What they were sorry about was that they lost. He knew that if they left, the economy would collapsed the way it collapsed in Angola, the way it collapsed in Mozambique. They were the well-educated managerial class. If they all picked up and left this first world economy, they had created South Africa as a first world economy. I mean, if you went to Cape Town or Johannesburg, into the white areas, you felt you were in what? Europe. The whole thing would come tumbling down. So he said to the whites, you can keep your land and your jobs. We will not nationalize the corporations. We will not take away your mines, the gold and the diamonds. We won't take away your jobs. We won't nationalize the banks. We'll let you keep your houses and the land. Are you serious? Didn't happen in Kenya. Didn't happen in Angola. Didn't happen in Mozambique. But it did happen in South Africa. Now, most of the whites, almost all of the whites, decided to stay. Let me explain why. To leave, you have to listen to South African exiles. They get tedious after a while. First of all, they don't have their cook anymore. Do you understand? And they don't have 3 maids. And so now they have to do their own cooking, their own cleaning. I mean, you understand, don't you? I mean, it's pretty rough. Not only that, the most beautiful city in the world that I've ever been in is Cape Town. It is gorgeous. You go out on that peninsula where the wineries are, I mean, it is paradise. If I could choose any place in the world where I'd like to have a kind of other home, if the politics were okay, do you understand? It would be Cape Town. I mean, you're leaving that, and I say with all kindness, Detroit. So people didn't want to leave, and he provided them with a reason for staying. But once they decided to stay, they were confronted with challenges. First of all, many blacks, angry that the whites still held their property, showed up and squatted on their land. And in fact, if you call the police were no longer willing to come and remove the squatters. And then there was the army and the police. The whites had been running it. But now, in many cases, certainly in the army and the police, they were being replaced by black officers. And so their sense of being in control, in power, was compromised. And then there was politics. The white party that had been victorious, the Nationalist Party, ends up as a minority party squabbling among itself. And the whites have no real access to any kind of political power. And then, worst of all, since there is overwhelming poverty, but now with independence, with liberation, there are high expectations. And now with no control over where you can live, thousands and thousands and thousands of poor blacks simply pour into the cities, right? And pouring into the cities, there are no jobs. The money and the land is still in the hands of the whites. They turn to an activity which poor people often do in order to make a living. It's called crime. So today in South Africa, if you're white, you need a dog, an alarm system. You can't go downtown in Johannesburg. You can't go downtown in Cape Town. You certainly wouldn't wear your rings and your what? And your jewelry. And so what happens is you live in this world of crime. Can you blame the poor for rebelling? The answer is what? No. Is it a terrible life for the whites, despite the wealth they retain? Yeah. Under the old system, what? You could call the police and right away. They came, they drove them out, they deported them to the Bantustans. That isn't possible anymore. One of the challenges is the incredible resentment expressed by black politicians over the agreement made by Mandela with the whites. They say it's not fair. In fact, one of the politicians that protested for a while was Mandela's former wife. Remember her? Oh. And she stood up and she said, what kind of a man is this who makes a deal with the whites? We have suffered. Our land was taken from us. We want it back. Those mines should be owned by the country. They shouldn't be owned by whites. They got all the money. What kind of liberation is that? One of the challenges was the language issue. Of the two white groups, the one group that the blacks hated the most was the Dutch. So when liberation occurred and the blacks took over, they made English the functioning language of South Africa, which meant for the Dutch whites, their language is what? Ignored. So now, if you're Dutch and you want to function in South Africa, using Dutch becomes increasingly what? Less viable. The language to be used by blacks and whites is now English. And certainly, one of the great challenges, the last one, is the challenge of Mr. Mugabe. Who's Mr. Mugabe? Well, to the north of South Africa, there is a country called Zimbabwe. It used to be called Rhodesia. When the whites were on what I would call a roll, the British whites were on a roll. They wanted to head north. They were going to connect British Egypt with British South Africa. They were heading north. And when diamonds were found and gold was found, Cecil Rhodes decided, well, maybe there are diamonds and gold in the north. So he pushed north and, in fact, seized a piece of land which was named after him, Rhodesia, which turned out not to have gold and diamonds, but great agricultural land, in particular for growing tobacco and wheat. And the whites moved in. They came from South Africa. They came from England. They settled down. And it was a regime very similar to that in South Africa. But in 1961, the British government, which controls Rhodesia, is trying to force the Rhodesians to accept democracy in the same way the British were now pressuring the people in Kenya, the whites in Kenya. But the Rhodesians, feeling support from South Africa, refused. And in fact, in 1965, the white people in Rhodesia simply announced their independence. The British government said, that's illegal, you're part of the British Empire, you can't do that. So they imposed sanctions. But actually between 1965 and 1980, Rhodesia was able to survive as a white-dominated country because it received support from South Africa. But by 1980, as the Soviet power began to decline, as black power rose in America, and as British power was declining greatly, the pressure was so great that in fact the white regime in Rhodesia collapsed. And in fact, blacks took over in Rhodesia. In South Africa, that was a sign of alarm. The leader of the blacks was a man who claimed to be a socialist by the name of Mugabe, M-U-G-A-B-E. And He was an intellectual, very articulate, mobilized a political party. And he's been the prime minister and the president of Rhodesia, but they had to change the name. Rhodesia was a name created by the whites. So they chose a name, the name of an old black empire that had existed in the area. The name of that empire was Zimbabwe. So he chose the name Zimbabwe, and now the country is Zimbabwe. The capital city is no longer Salisbury. The capital city is now Harare, and so forth. And having done that, he proceeds to govern. But again, Mugabe did what Mandela did. The people who ran the Rhodesian economy were the whites. And he said to them, you can keep your land. Oh. So, some left, but what? Most stayed. And then he changed his mind. Changed his mind because he was not running a good economy. And in fact, the way he decided to win back the support of his own people was to say, I made a mistake. What we need to do is to kick the whites out of Zimbabwe. And actually in April 2000 began the campaign, which is still going on in Zimbabwe. The campaign to drive out the whites. Blacks without land have been mobilized by the government. They enter into the white estates, and they drive out the white owners, and they take over the estates. The economy is now in ruins. White farmers are fleeing. No compensation for taking over their land. And now in South Africa, the people who are there are asking a question. If it's happening in Zimbabwe, maybe it will what? Happen here. Do you understand? That is, we're only a few steps ahead always of Rhodesia, of Zimbabwe. If it's happening there, what if Nelson Mandela dies? He's in his mid-80s. What if the new president, Mbeki, who's no Mandela, what if he sees that the economy isn't going well and he wishes to win the approval of the what? The blacks? Won't he do the same thing? Won't he simply get up and say, take away the land? So right now in South Africa, as in Zimbabwe, the question is very big for the whites. Should we or should we not stay? And if you want to know what answer is arising, come back in 5 minutes. Thank you. And now, let me pick up the question, which was the question at the beginning of our discussion, the future of European whites in Africa. Let me start off with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is interesting because President Chirac of France has done something that has angered both the United States of America and many of the European powers. He is holding a conference on Africa. And he invited to that conference the president of Zimbabwe, whose name is Mugabe. Now, Mugabe, over the last few years, has been placed under condemnation by European powers, not simply because he's confiscating white land without compensation, but because he won't run any fair elections. That is, in Zimbabwe, there is disagreement over the tactic of Mugabe. Many blacks, maybe a majority of the blacks in Zimbabwe, dislike Mugabe because his regime is hopelessly corrupt. And so there is an opposition black party that was organized about 4 years ago, the purpose of which was to overthrow, through an election, Mugabe. And one of the reasons why Mugabe chose the tactic of confiscating white land was to win support from black people for his regime. But the opposition party says the following. One, even if all the land is taken over by the blacks, the government is so corrupt, most of the wealth will end up in the hands of a few blacks instead of the hands of a few whites. And two, and it's realistic, the Zimbabwean economy depends on agriculture. Agriculture depends on large farms. Large farms, for their success, depend on expert management. And the people who have the skills for management are presently the whites. And if you drive them out of Zimbabwe, the what? The whole economy will fall apart and collapse. And that certainly was demonstrated, as we know, in Portuguese Africa. So the Zimbabwean economy, which was functioning very well under white control, is in danger of total collapse. And of course the opposition party says, of course we want greater rewards for the black population. But the key to doing this is not to drive out the whites. Well, Mugabe held an election recently, which was obviously rigged. He didn't even want international observers. And in fact, he has groups of thugs. When I was in Harare last, I saw the thugs. You don't fool around with them. The main party is called ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union. And it has the tallest building, I think, in Harare as its headquarters. And in fact, people are afraid to speak their mind. During the election, ballots were not available in many of the rural areas where opposition was centered. He won the election, but it was obviously through cheating. And it was after he cheated that the European powers condemned him. It's rather interesting about Mr. Chirac, whether you think he's right or wrong about the war. The French sometimes are absolutely infuriating. They have what I call selective ethics. On the one hand, they're saying how terrible it will be to destroy people in Iraq, and out of the other side of the mouth, they're playing footsie with African dictators condemned by Africans themselves. So Mugabe hasn't had an invitation for a long time. And in fact, the isolation of Mugabe is what? Not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But Zimbabwe is under the iron fist right now of Mugabe. He has cowed the opposition, and the economy is collapsing, and his answer to that is interesting. His answer to that is to say, Zimbabwe has been the prisoner of the global economy, and we have been the prisoners of the global economy. And who runs the global economy? The Americans. And how do they run the global economy? Through something called the International Monetary Fund, which decides whether you get money. And the International Monetary Fund says that you can't run your government with deficits. I disagree. So he said, to hell with International Monetary Fund. We're seceding from this corrupt global economy, and in fact, we're borrowing as much money as we need. So he's borrowed money. Well, you borrow money, but there's no way to what? To pay it back because the economy is totally collapsing. So now the rate of inflation is 145%. I mean, just going, it's rising, rising, rising. I mean, the whole thing is a total mess. And whites are fleeing. he's taken over somewhere around 1/3 of the white farms. And it's very clear he plans on taking over more. He says he will compensate at a rate that he decides is appropriate. But no compensation so far. So the agricultural economy, which lies at the heart of the country, is collapsing, which means it isn't that they're growing no food for export. They're not able to grow food for local consumption. There's mass starvation in Zimbabwe. The managers are fleeing, and the what? There's starvation. Now, what's happening in Zimbabwe is not lost on South African whites. Because if Mugabe could change his mind, and if what appeared to be a stable regime in which whites were allowed to remain with their money and their houses, even with a black government, if that's collapsing in Zimbabwe, then what does it mean in South Africa? So you're down in Cape Town and you're reading about what's going on in Harare. What's the handwriting on the wall? All right. So let me talk about South Africa now. South Africa now has a new president. He was the right-hand man in the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela. He's no Nelson Mandela. His name is Mbeki, spelled M-B-E-K-I. And, of course, he started out his presidency with the colossal boo-boo that I mentioned 3 lectures ago. He started out by saying, AIDS is not related to HIV infection. I mean, Mandela said, shut up. It's the most stupid thing anybody said. What do you mean it's not? Now, Mbeki is the governor of a political party, the African National Congress, which is the dominant party in South Africa, the party of most of the blacks. And Mbeki has 2 factions in his political party. One faction says, we can't run this country without whites, so we can't scare them away. We have to remain part of the global economy, to talk to the International Monetary Fund. We've got to do all of this stuff. The other faction says, we want justice. White people came here and they took away our land, they took away all the wealth, and what we want is a fair share. So there has to be a redistribution of the money. Well, so Mbeki has these 2 factions. Can he ignore the second faction? That's the question. Because the second faction is growing in power. Because many, many South Africans, many, many black South Africans are now becoming disillusioned. They expected that with liberation their economic situation would improve. And what they're discovering is that it hasn't improved at all. What they've gotten is the vote. And they use the vote to elect the African National Congress. But the African National Congress has decided to let the whites keep their land and their wealth. So what's the vote? And in fact, if you go to South Africa today, if you're a tourist, you'll see a lot of blacks now living in nice areas. You'll see a lot of blacks working in the banks and in the store, or whatever else it is, the whole thing. And you'll see the beginnings of a rising black bourgeoisie and middle class. You'll see all of that. But South Africa is still divided the way it was divided the last time I was there in 1990. Part of South Africa is the first world. If you go to the white areas, it's what? It's Europe, it's England, Holland. And then the rest of South Africa is the third world. People are driving on expressways on lovely cars. And meanwhile, walking along the expressways are dozens of people who walk because what? They have no other form of transportation on the roads. Walk, walk, walk. And they live in housing that is substandard. I mean, go to Soweto, which still remains, which was created as a black segregated suburb. It's still a black suburb. In Soweto, you will see some lovely homes built by what? Rich blacks. But on the whole, the life of the blacks has not greatly improved. Freedom has not brought the economic benefits that they thought that they would be able to get. So it's a lot of discontent. The consequence, by the way, is that the rate of white emigration is increasing. Whites are very apprehensive about Mbeki and what may happen. They're apprehensive about the influence of faction number 2. And so they're beginning to emigrate. Where do South African whites go? Well, where they would love to go, their first destination is often a favorite for Detroiters. It's called Southern California. Oh, they love Southern California. The weather is what? Just like South Africa. There's no plateau. Well, there's a mountain, whatever. They love Southern California. I love Southern California. No, I mean, it's a very nice place. But getting into the United States of America isn't always easy. And departing South Africa is not easy because if you have assets in South Africa, you can't remove them easily from South Africa. They did that in order to prevent whites from leaving that easily and taking their wealth with them. So you have to be able to do what's called finagling. You have some money hidden away in a Swiss bank account or something like that, and you're able to take your money out. It's easier for professional people than it is for business people, because business people have buildings and stores and things like that, and removing their wealth is more difficult. The second favorite place is a country that's not too far from South Africa, right across the Indian Ocean, and where the climate is very similar to South Africa, Australia. Australia is loaded with refugee South Africans. Now, South Africans, because they lived in this mixed society of tension, tend to be more aggressive and on edge than Australians are ready to go to the beach anytime. They're very laid back, and in fact, there's a kind of cultural a tension between the South African immigrants and the Australians. But Australia is a great place to go. So there's Southern California, there is Australia. A few want to go back to Europe, but that isn't a destination that they really want. In all cases, they come into a world where there are no easily available servants. Their lifestyle radically changes. And the other thing is what some Dutch farmers are doing. They're saying, if we're going to live among blacks and lose our language, we might as well, and if we want to stay in Africa, let's go live in an African place where they want us. So many Dutch farmers have been moving north into places like Tanzania. There are black governments that want white farmers. And so they've been moving up into places like Tanzania, even to the Congo, whatever, believe it or not, because they said, we're going to live among blacks? What? We might as well go to a place where we're wanted and appreciated. But that's only a very, very small number. One of the consequences is what I would call first stage and second stage emigration. Many people who live in Johannesburg, which is a city of lots of crime and violence. It's a very ugly city. It's surrounded by piles of gold slag all around it. So what they do is they move first to Cape Town, because Cape Town is what? less criminally affected, and is a more beautiful place to be. And then Cape Town is the next step to, or the first step to actually leaving. One of the consequences is that the white political party has collapsed. Whites are no longer believing in the possibility that whites can share political power, have political power, any kind of political power in South Africa. And what I found most interesting, recently in the paper there were two articles. Some whites are turning to active rebellion. They're doing to the blacks what the blacks had done to the whites. Not the English never do that. It's the Dutch Afrikaners who say, this is our home. This is our place. One of the things they've organized is a secret society called the Boerameg, which means Boer force. And what they've been doing is blowing up installations, telephone pole, whatever else it is, to express their apprehension, to express their hostility to the existing government. What's their agenda? Do they expect to overthrow the black government? Well, they say their agenda is that they want to annoy the black government enough so that the black government will give them a little piece of land in South Africa that will be what? White only and theirs. It's an absolute what? Illusion, but it's simply a sign of the frustration. What are the realities today among the whites in South Africa? There's overwhelming pessimism. I mean, there is a small minority of people who still say, well, Mandela's legacy will continue, but Mandela is going to die in a few years, and it's not clear that the person who follows is going to maintain the Mandela legacy. There is very clear repression of whites in a country adjacent to it, that's in Zimbabwe. And that's the great fear, that the repression that exists in Zimbabwe will cross the border and be imitated by Mbeki, by the South African government. There is an unpleasant environment of tension that you live in. Let me just describe it. When you get on the roads in South Africa, even if you're a tourist with a rented car, they'll always tell you, be very careful. Because somebody might come up by the side, stop you, and take the car. The level of crime, which has increased because the economy simply cannot sustain the expectations of the majority of the people who are poor and desperately poor, is such that even if you're rich, do you understand, even if you have servants, life is just unpleasant. It's a trial. You're afraid to go out at night. You're afraid to go downtown. You're afraid to go on the expressway. You're afraid to wear anything that's worth anything. I mean, so it's like, why bother? One of the realities is that many outsiders now, looking at what's happening in South Africa, seeing what happened in Zimbabwe, who might invest in South Africa, and South Africa is the major industrial power in Africa. It is the richest black nation in Africa. And the reason it is the richest black nation in Africa was because whites came and what? Organized the economy, and now it's there. And in fact is a kind of mobilizer for the economies of Africa. South African goods are sold all over Africa now. They come from a black nation. But they need investors. And Zimbabwe is scaring a lot of investors. If they invest in South Africa, will they discover that in 5 or 6 years things will be what? Nationalized, and they will receive only a small part of their investment back as compensation? One of the realities is that if the whites collectively leave South Africa, it will be an economic disaster. Yes, there is a rising black bourgeoisie. Yes, it is true that more blacks are being educated and graduating from the universities. But it's not fast enough. if that managerial class is driven out of South Africa, then the economy itself will collapse, and that's been demonstrated by what's happened in other parts of Africa. One of the realities is that among the rising black bourgeoisie, there is increasing integration. If you go to South Africa, you will find in many of the nice suburbs in Johannesburg that now what? Blacks live. In many cases, the blacks are not business people. In many cases, the blacks are now officials of the what? Of the new government. But there is the beginning of integration, and there are attempts to provide for greater understanding. And in fact, if the whites could be persuaded to stay, then most likely this level of integration would increase, but the integration is minor, not major. One of the realities is the continued tension between English and Dutch whites. The Dutch whites resent the fact that English has been made the only official language, basically, of South Africa. All things happen in English, and the Dutch are terribly resentful. You think that after all this time, this argument would stop as they face a shared and common danger. So what are the implications for the future? Well, you can see what's happening in Zimbabwe. The whites are what? Leaving, and Zimbabwe will become like Angola and Mozambique. I think it's too late to persuade them to stay. There will be, as in Kenya, a small number of them who remain. This is their home, this is where they want to be, and whatever. But the days of a significant white population in Zimbabwe, that most likely is gone. In South Africa, the beginnings already of nationalization are coming. It was in the New York Times a short while ago. The government of South Africa has decided that all mineral wealth should be owned by the government. And they're in the process of nationalizing the gold mines, the diamond mines, and whatever. So what is the role of the corporations? Well, what the corporations will do is they lease. You understand? The government owns the mines, and they what? They lease the mines, they'll manage the mines, and they will arrange for distribution, but the ultimate ownership will lie with the government. That's happened in other countries, and in fact, the leasing corporations have adjusted to it. But it's a sign of a significant change. The third is that the white population in South Africa will not, unless there's a major rebellion, dramatically decrease in a year or two as it did in Angola and Mozambique. What is now happening is the mood has changed. There is a gradual emigration. It's just going to, do you understand? Not dramatically, just gradually shrink. Right now there are about 4 million whites in South Africa. One can presume that within 20 years it could easily be down to 2 million whites. It's a shrinking population, and the more it shrinks, the greater the motivation of whites to leave. That is, the shrinking of the white population destroys the white enclaves that many whites view as their security. And so there most likely will be a gradual emigration, and there's no doubt about it. If the South African government doesn't know how to reverse the economic decline, this major industrial power will become less industrial. There will be more poverty. With more poverty, there will be more crime. With more crime, there will be more violence. And one of the interesting things about Africa, and we have to recognize it, the time has come in many African countries to transcend what I call racist resentments, because the racist resentments simply trigger political action that drives out the managerial class. And really what Africa needs is about 25 Mandelas. And maybe before he dies, he'll arrange to be cloned. He has to be cloned because he indeed was the restraining force. He could have gone the other way. And he could have destroyed the South African economy almost immediately. He chose not to do it. He's a very, very wise man. But where do you find the other Mandelas, and how does any black political figure without the charisma and prestige of Mandela resist all the pressures coming justifiably from the bottom? Do you understand? Saying, we want our share. The big question for all third world countries is how to produce a talented and non-corrupt managerial class. We have difficulty producing that in the United States of America. We've been able to produce competent, but in recent years it's not always what? Non-corrupt. So we're having that trouble in America. I mean, that's the great challenge. Right now, the whites in Africa serve, certainly in southern Africa, serve that purpose. And their quick departure would be a danger. If it's a very gradual departure, it may be the case that black managers will what? Emerge in time to be the replacement for the white manager. But if it's a dramatic departure, it will be devastating for the economy of South Africa. The Europeans came, and now the Europeans are leaving, and nobody really knows how to stop it. So all I can say, as the congenital optimist, I hope the departure will be what? So gradual that an alternative black managerial class will emerge to take the place of the whites who will be leaving. And so if you're planning on moving to Southern California, do it quickly, because otherwise some South African will take your condo. Thank you very, very much.